Well guys, we are finally here. This is going to be the last episode that I post about the Ferrari until I try to fire it up for the very first time, but we've got a lot of work cut out for us in this one because the engine's not even in the car at the moment. We've got to get the engine installed, we've got wiring to do, we got connectors to pin, we got hoses to make and install, we've got lots of parts to fit back in the engine bay, we got welding to do. I mean, there is a ton of work left, but I'm excited about it. I'm a day behind for a reason, so let me quit talking about it. Let's get to it and get this thing to the finish line. Let's go. The goal of today's episode is to get the engine back in the car so we can fire it up. I've explained that already. But the intake and exhaust manifolds on my engine have only been held on by spare parts bin bolts because my motor didn't come with them. So first on our list is to get those bolts measured up and get new ones on order so we can install these parts for good. With bolts ordered, we can turn our attention to the battery terminals, which is where we left off in the previous episode. We were waiting on these. They're bulkhead connectors so that we can pass power and ground through the rear firewall safely. I'm going to mount these bulkhead connectors to the left of all of our equipment inside of the car. This will locate the terminals relatively close to the battery and keep all of our wiring tidy and short. With both terminals in place, let's take a look from the other side, through the engine bay, so you can get an idea of how these terminals pass through the firewall. We just need to run cables from these terminals to our battery so that we have power. Although at some point, we also need to wire in a kill switch, but that's for a future episode. Over on the workbench, I got all the parts and pieces together so that we can finish up wiring these terminals in. I built the cables that go from the Nexus R5 ECU to these terminals and to the secondary PDM. I also built the cables that will run to the battery, but we're not going to connect those yet because we don't want to actually power anything on. Everything turned out pretty nicely though, so let's head back over to the car and get it all installed. I'll need to do a little bit of tidying, maybe with some P-clamps or something of the sort, but everything's sitting where I want it and I'm happy with the outcome. I want a nice, tidy wiring setup that I can easily understand anytime I come back to work on it. Before the engine goes back in, we've got to reinstall the fuel cell, and its construction means that the bottom panel is removable. Or rather, it's not attached at all, because the actual bladder of the cell has to enter from the bottom. I was surprised to hear that this isn't supposed to seal up in any way, but Harman Racing Cells assures me this is indeed the way it's meant to be. So all we're going to do is add a rubber pad to the bottom in order to isolate the fuel cell from vibration and fatigue. I ordered up a huge 1/8 inch thick sheet of rubber so that we can cut it out and adhere it to the bottom. So after marking it out with a marker, I cut it in the shear and then applied a bunch of spray adhesive to it so we can adhere it straight to the aluminum. I had a hunch that the spray adhesive wouldn't really stick to the rubber, but it turns out this Gorilla Glue spray adhesive worked amazing. It stuck the rubber down immediately and held it firmly in place. We can now put the fuel cell back on its base panel, and I'm going to tape it into place just to hold it together while I lower it back into the car. There is one other step that I want to tackle using that rubber though, and that's to modify the top mounts that we made in a previous episode. These odd-looking brackets support the top corners of the fuel cell, and they're just one of many pieces that'll help keep the cell from moving in the event of an accident. We need to mount them to the firewall, so they're going to need some holes drilled in them, so I drew this up in CAD. It's going to act as both a drilling template and the DXF file for a backing plate that we'll have laser cut and install at a later time. For now, I'm only going to drill 1/8 inch holes in these mounts, and that's so that I can accurately mark on the firewall where we want to drill and bolt them down to. I want to isolate these mounts with rubber just like we did the base of the fuel cell, so it's important that we go in and cut those and add those pads to these mounts now. The added thickness of the rubber attached to the mount will change where it sits on the firewall, and if we try to add them later, none of our holes will line up. I'll clean up and adhere the rubber to the mounts after we get the mounts powder coated, but that's going to happen later down the line, so for now let's just get everything mocked up in the car and get some accurate marks for drilling. Unfortunately, to do this correctly means we have to install the fuel cell, mock up the mounts, make some marks, and then remove the mounts, remove the fuel cell, and get the holes drilled, only to put everything back in after we're done. Actually, drilling the holes required me to use a 90-degree drill. There's really not much room in here with these diagonal down bars. But thankfully it did the trick, and with the holes drilled, we can put everything back into the car once again, and ideally, for the last time until we rip this thing apart for paint. With the fuel cell back in place, it does mean that we can proceed forward with the steps needed to actually put the engine back in. We tackled a lot of the welding in the engine bay previously, but I've realized that there are still some parts and pieces that need to get welded up, such as some of the engine mounts that attach to the engine itself. So I got that stuff knocked out, and then I climbed back into the engine bay one final time. While I'm pretty sure that I could have welded all of these joints with the engine in place, there's no doubt that it would have been a huge challenge. I decided it was probably smarter to climb in the engine bay one more time and get this welding done without the engine in place. I'd have a lot more room and comfort and access for everything, and it seems worthwhile to delay putting the engine in by a single day or even a few hours to get this done now. There's still plenty of gaps and joints that I'll have to weld in the future, especially once the car is up on a lift, but this should do the trick for the time being, and I trust its structural integrity to drive the car, at least for testing purposes, in its current state. Alright, excuse the quick talking head segment for a moment, but I have to address this because my last episode probably got 100 comments about it. You guys keep asking, why did I not paint the engine bay, or am I going to paint the engine bay before the engine goes back in, or what's going on here? And that's a fair question, but the entire car is going to get disassembled when we finally do paint this thing, including the engine bay. I want everything done really well, I want to get it all blasted, and I want the outcome of this thing to be as good as I can possibly make it. Now, yeah, we could do some painting in here right now, but if it's going to all get redone later, I don't see a point. And I don't really want to do any paint work in here right now because there's still a lot of work to do. I mean, we might be close to getting this engine running, but there's still a lot of welding that we need to do in here. There's going to be supports and extra stuff we're going to tie in once we're all done. There's still a lot of kind of fabrication, and there's problem solving to happen. And I don't want to be working around fresh paint. I don't want to be chipping and scratching stuff. Just, that's the wrong order of operations. I'd rather just go through the legwork of pulling this stuff back out and finishing everything at the finish. Maybe that's why it's called finish work. That's not true, but that's whatever. Doesn't matter. So with that in mind, my buddy John and I dropped the engine back into the unpainted engine bay. Despite being such a small engine going into such a large engine bay, the overall width is a bit of a problem. The engine and transmission barely clear the upper chassis rails, leaving only a couple of millimeters to spare. It was helpful to have John here lowering this into place, as it's a pretty challenging job to do solo. It feels good getting the engine bolted back into place for what should be the final time, and it concluded one of the longest shop days in a long while. The next morning, I got to work putting all of the important pieces back in the engine bay, starting with the Rye-Wire engine harness. We've mocked the harness up in the engine bay before, but we've never actually connected it to everything. That's because, for the most part, we've been missing a lot of sensors, parts, pieces, and components. But now, because we actually want to run the car, it's time to plug in everything that we can. When it comes to reinstalling the intake manifold, I finally have gaskets for it and the exhaust manifold, along with the bolts that we measured for at the beginning of the episode. It's not the fanciest hardware, but I'll be happy knowing that it all matches, and I'll know what size everything is from now on anytime I need to work on it. I thought about doing something like specialty 12-point hardware, but the last thing I need is to try to find specialty sockets when I need to fix something at the racetrack. After getting the intake manifold installed, I worked my way around the engine, installing more of the wiring harness, and then turning my attention to the turbo manifold. But around then, a new gadget arrived at the StanceWorks shop, a piece of camera gear that will allow me to do some new, unique time-lapse shots that I'm excited to use a lot more of in future episodes. I tinkered with it for a few minutes and only managed to get one shot, but here it is. Check this out. The ability to have both panning and tracking time-lapse shots should add a whole new dynamic to my episodes, and it should really help keep those time-lapse shots from becoming boring. It's a pretty cool effect for a $250 gizmo, and I'm excited to use it a lot more. Now there's one thing that I realized that I probably need to fix, not before we start it, but before we actually run this thing. If you look real closely right here, the gasket's not compressed against the head, and that is a sign that I warped this flange as I welded this up, which honestly isn't surprising. This is my first time TIG welding more or less anything on this manifold, and it's not the best job. I'll take it over to Brett across the street and see if he has a solution for flattening it out, or maybe we can deck it, but we'll need to sort that out because that won't work. With the turbo manifold installed, we're on the home stretch. I installed the turbo, the exhaust, the dry sump oil tank and filter, the water-to-air intercooler and all of the intake piping, and a few other final bits and pieces. So let's talk about where we stand and what we need to actually fire this thing up. There's still a pile of AN hoses sitting on the shop floor that we need to install, and I've got a running list of quite a few sensors that I'm going to need to order, but thankfully they're all from Haltech and local, so I should have them tomorrow. I also need to plumb the oil lines for the turbo. It's something that I completely forgot until I reinstalled it today. I also need to make a battery cable to the starter and alternator, and once I power everything up, I need to get Andrew from Animal Auto over to the shop to put a base map on the computer. After all, we'll need that if we expect it to turn on. It's not a short list, but it's one that I feel pretty good about, and I think we can get it all finished up in one episode that we can conclude with our first ever start of the Honda-swapped Ferrari. Alright, so that should be all of the groundwork laid for our first start. I know there are a few loose ends to tie up, but nothing that should keep us from attempting to start it. Now I'm going to take you guys along for the ride, even if the car doesn't start, but the next episode, barring any major issues, should be a first start attempt, and I'm pretty excited for it. There are some things that I've got to sort out. I know that I need to wire in some sort of electrical kill switch, which we talked about earlier. I need to wire up the starter. I didn't make a power cable to the starter so that it'll actually, have the juice to fire up. And we got to fill it with fluids, things like that, but all stuff that should make a good episode and get us to that first start. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't and click the bell. I know it sounds so silly to say that stuff, but you don't want to miss it, and it helps me out. It's mutually beneficial. I want you guys here for that first start, and who knows when it's actually going to be. I'm not really on a hard schedule right now. I'm trying to take my time and make the best episodes that I can instead of adhering to a very strict schedule. I think it works better for me and gives you guys better content. So anyways, I'm done yapping. I hope you guys have enjoyed this one. I hope you guys are here for the next one. It should be pretty exciting. Barring any major issues, first start, we're here, it's done. And once it runs, man, I'm gonna need those wheels because I'm gonna wanna get this thing on the ground as soon as possible and start getting all of the loose ends tied up so that we have a functioning vehicle. And then there's still paint and all sorts of other stuff. We're really, we're moving along here. So anyways, this episode's a wrap. Thank you guys for the support. I'll catch you guys next week. See you then.